a warm welcome to everyone joining us today for this event. Good morning, good evening to those joining from different parts of the world. Joining on a beautiful spring day here in Washington, D.C. And Markus is based in New York. Matt is also based on the East Coast, and Claudia is based in Berlin. We're here to discuss transatlantic relations in light of great power competition between the US and China. I'm Müller-Kaler. I'm an associate fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations and had the pleasure to work with Markus the last 2.5 years on this USA strategy group, which has been initiated by a grant from the Frieda Springer Foundation, to which we want to give a special shout out of gratitude here as we are concluding the strategy group with this event. The idea was initially imagined by Josef Bramel, who I've heard is in the audience. So Josef, a special shout out to you as well. And Markus and I have had the pleasure to work on the US strategy group with a group of experts from civil society, from politics, from the German economic business sector during the pandemic. The idea initially was to discuss domestic affairs in the United States of America, because the Trump presidency obviously was such a big challenge to transatlantic relations and to the uncertainty that came with it, and potential re-election in 2020 was the very idea, so that we find a forum for German decision makers to discuss in a strategic way the future of the transatlantic relationship. But as we went on during the pandemic, China obviously became an even hotter topic here and on the other side of the Atlantic. So as much as this strategy group was about US politics and the transatlantic relationship, it was also about the relationship with Germany's biggest trading partner, namely the People's Republic of China, and how transatlantic relations are changing in light of US and China great power competition. So I'm very delighted to welcome all of you here for this presentation and discussion. We are joined by a terrific panel. You are seeing that the initial person from the BDE is unfortunately not able to join us today due to a family situation, but we found a stellar replacement, namely Matt Burrows, who you see. He's joining us from the United States. He's now the program lead at the Stimson Center and a co-worker of mine in the Strategic Foresight Hub, and spent his time in the CIA and the State Department, at the end of which he was at the National Intelligence Council, where he did long-range analysis for the Obama and Bush administration, and works a lot on China, US-China relations and global trends. The other person that I'd like to introduce is Claudia Schmucker, who is the head of the Geopolitics, Geo-Economics and Technology program at the German Council on Foreign Relations, and her work focuses on geoeconomics as well. So she'll be a wonderful commentator for the presentation. And last but not least, Markus Jaeger, who is a research fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations and also an adjunct professor at Columbia University. And as I said, I've had the pleasure to work and coordinate the US strategy group with him the last 2.5 years until Dominic Tolksdorf, another colleague from the DGAP, joined us in this endeavor. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Markus, who will start with the presentation on discussing some of the research findings. We'll have comments afterwards from Claudia and Matt, do a panel, and then open it up also for Q&A. We have such a rich audience today and want to hear from you, hear your questions, your thoughts. The event is scheduled to take place until 1 p.m. Eastern time, which is 7 p.m. German time. We might end a little earlier. Just want to have enough time to answer all your questions and get all your rich insights into the conversation. So Markus, thanks for joining us today from New York City. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Julian, and thank you all for joining. What I thought I'd do in the next 15 minutes is talk a bit about the geopolitics and the geoeconomics of the project. Of course, it's very difficult to summarize a 3-year research project where we publish multiple papers and annual reports in 15 minutes. So the focus will be on, as Julian mentioned, on the China-US relationship, and how this shapes China's strategy, and how that strategy, the US strategy towards China, is likely to impact the economic and financial relationship with, particularly with Europe, and how Europe will be probably forced to adjust to that situation and the kind of challenges that emerge from that. And towards the end, I'll also make some broad suggestions as to what the Europeans ought to be considering in terms of a strategic response here. So the way we approach this, and of course there's a million ways of approaching longer-term scenario international politics, was to think of really US strategy as the main driver of the overall relationship. You necessarily have to focus on the number of factors in your scenario analysis. So there are many other scenarios imaginable here, but that's the one we chose. And we looked at our history, but we also looked at what's happening at the margin. And we thought of US strategy as being driven by three broad factors. One is international system, and primarily the competition that emerges from it. And here, of course, China has become very dominant over the past few years, even more dominant today than 3 years ago, and certainly than 10 years ago. The second one, when you engage international competition, is the issue of how many resources do you have available, and can you mobilize them? So that's also a very, very key issue here. And then thirdly, of course, and Julian talked about this, is domestic politics. Initially, when the project was conceived, it was conceived on the basis of what happens if Trump wins another election and what happens to the Transatlantic relationship. I think that's a scenario that should not be dismissed, of course. But there are other factors domestically that play a role. So the extent to which, for example, domestic political forces can constrain the executive in formulating strategy and in generating the kinds of resources necessary to pursue that strategy. Ilya, could you please move on to the next slide? Great, thank you so much. So here you see it, international system, the availability of resources, and domestic politics. I'm not going to go too much into this. I just want to say we gave it some thought. We played around with some factors to see what kind of outputs we get. And at the very, very macro level, three strategies have historically, arguably, characterized U.S. foreign policy. One, I would say, is economic cooperation. That's primarily what we saw between like 1990 and say 2010 during this unipolar moment where the US was dominant, where China joined the global economic system, where Russia joined the IMF, the WTO, and so on. The second one that we've observed historically was isolationism. And I think that scenario really was the main concern underpinning the original intent here. Of course, Trump coming to power, insisting on a more transactional relationship in terms of America First policy, Make America Great Again policy. And we've seen some of the tension disruptions in the transatlantic relationship in particular. And the third one is more a security-dominated strategy, where if the system is not dominated by one power and you have great power rivalry, then you will not necessarily, your main strategy will not be primarily focused on economic gains and absolute gains, but you will engage in limited economic cooperation, but your aim here really is to prevail in security terms. And so when we started the process 3 years ago, I think that was certainly in the cards. I think now it's very clear that this is the strategy the US has opted to pursue in terms of approach to China. Could we get the next slide, please? And so there has been this evolution in the United States from this notion that really not everybody in the United States embraced, but 15 years ago, under Bob Zodik, this idea that China would be integrated into the global system as a responsible stakeholder. That hasn't materialized. We've seen tensions between the US and China increase. I would date this to maybe 2008, 2009. We can speculate as to why that is, but we've certainly seen a much more assertive China since then in the security realm, but also in economics and finance. And so if you go to Washington these days, no one will talk about a responsible stakeholder. People will be talking about a peer competitor. And that's exactly how the US national security strategy that was released by Biden last year refers to China. And we look at the chart, you see already that China is larger than the United States. And that is significant, of course, because it makes good sense to see China as to the extent that relationships are conflictual, to see China as a competitor that has potentially larger resources. Even though, and I don't want to get too much into detail here, but there's the issue of like how much of this GDP can you mobilize in pursuit of your foreign policy strategy. But the point is just to say that when you look at the global system, there's two dominant powers, maybe two and a half, if you include the EU, and it's the US and China is already larger than the United States. The next slide, please. Again, here it's just to throw out a few ideas. GDP is not enough, and I'll be happy to in the Q&A go into more details here. It's clear that the United States faces certain constraints when it comes to government debt, for example, when it comes to implicit liabilities the US government is facing. And also, of course, when you look at the United States' external position financially, you see that the US is the world's largest debtor, certainly in dollar terms, but also a significant debtor when it comes as a share of GDP. So this is just to say that, yes, GDP matters, but the US is, in addition, perhaps constrained by some of these debt issues. On the other hand, what I'm not showing you here, if you project this longer term, is China's challenges. They're also quite significant. I'll skip this here, but it's important to bear in mind that even though often we see these great power rivalries, and they tend to last for a long time. In fact, just before joining that meeting, I looked up how long the contest between Qatar and Rome lasted, and in fact lasted more than 100 years. And if you look at Sparta and Athens, that conflict lasted almost 30 years, and the conflict certainly 60 or 70 years. Again, I'm not projecting war or massive conflict here. It's just to say we're looking at the future through the prism of this geopolitical rivalry. And clearly what's very important here is the availability of resources on both sides. And projecting this out much further than 5 or 10 years is very difficult, but that doesn't mean it should not be done. Can we get the next slide, please? And here it's just, these are IMF numbers, so you can take it or leave it, but that's an interesting one, because what you see here is if you take the United States' position in Asia and you aggregate the GDP of the United States and its treaty allies, so that's primarily Japan, Korea, where the Philippines is very small, and Australia, you see before the end of this decade, China's economic size will outstrip the size of the alliance. Now there's a question of what do you do with India, what do you do with Indonesia, but it gives you a sense of like where this is trending on the current trajectory. And I think here the conclusion or the inference is that the United States will have to mobilize greater resources and will have to deploy them to Asia. Why? Because it has two strategic objectives. One is to prevent the emergence of a hegemon in East Asia. There's this concern of Asia being dominated by China economically, politically, and militarily, potentially. And the second one is, and that has a long history of maintaining access to Asian markets. And so this sets China and the US up for great power competition. So the way to look at this is the US would like to maintain the status quo, and China is a revisionist power. And I mean revisionism in an empirical sense, not in any normative sense. So this sets these two powers up to engage in competition and even economic conflict. What are the consequences here for Europe? I think it's very clear, and it's been very clear for a very long time, and you can even read the Trump foreign policy to some extent through that prism, is that the US will continue to push for greater burden sharing. It's true the Ukraine conflict right now has sort of muddied waters a little bit, but this will certainly come back just because of broader macro trends. And the second one is that something that also we've seen with increasing intensity over the past few years is the United States and China having a go at each other in geo-economic terms, in terms of selective decoupling, technological restrictions, trade restrictions, financial restrictions. And this is exactly where Europe will be in a very difficult position against the backdrop of this great power competition over the next few decades. Get the next slide, please. I'm not going to go into this. It gets pretty technical pretty quickly, just to sort of give you a sense of what's at stake here. So clearly, the US, but also China on certain occasions has used export controls. Import restrictions are being used. On the financial side, just this morning, there was a piece in Politico saying that the US is readying a new regime for outward investment. So US investment can't just go anywhere anymore freely. It needs the investor has to notify the US government. So the point here is, without going into detail, is that there's a large number of restrictions, a large number of tools being used to, if you will, effectively interrupt international trade or make it more difficult. Not wholesale. Many of these are very targeted, very selective, but it does mean that the US and China are using those tools more and more. Now, the challenge here is to some extent, and again, I'll be very brief here, that the United States in some areas have the ability to not just impose unilateral measures, but it can also make these measures stick and enforce vis-a-vis third parties. And here Europe would come into play. If you think, for example, of the Iran situation, that we've seen it happen there, The US has also recently used it when it comes to export controls of semiconductors, where Japan and the Netherlands sort of came around and agreed, but quite frankly, didn't have all that much choice because the US was putting enormous pressure on them to like align their policies with the US policy. And so here's the problem really, that Europe is at risk in some sectors at least, of ending up between the fronts in a US-Chinese geo-economic conflict. Can we get the next slide, please? And this is, of course, highly relevant, and I'm not telling you anything new here, for a country like Germany, which not only is one of the most open economies in the world in numerical terms, but also itself is highly integrated and exposed to trade with both China and the United States. So that's fact number one. Now, when you're asking me, well, how significant is it if trade with, for example, China were to fall away, how significant would the impact? Some studies have been done. I'd be very cautious about running with those numbers, but it's clear that the dependence is quite significant. What's also significant is that Germany is the most vulnerable country in that equation in Europe. So if you were a third party and you wanted to sway European policy, probably the country you'd be looking at is Berlin, because Berlin, or a country like Germany, and you would go to Berlin because you probably have a good chance of influencing European policies by talking to Berlin or even putting pressure on Berlin. And you see that's, by the way, true for both imports and exports. And I think, arguably, this explains some of the caution, traditional caution of the German government when it comes to China, arguably. Take the next slide, please. Again, I'll be brief here on what can be done. Let me just summarize this in the interest of time, that basically from a European perspective, and in many cases, but not all cases, this is a European policy when it comes to trade, less so when it comes to investment. It's a question of what do you do in a harsher international, if you will, a more Hobbesian economic environment internationally. And here you have to make a choice. If you take remedial measures to insulate yourself from some of these pressures and conflicts that are coming your way, then you're going to incur economic costs. So in a sense, you have to buy security through incurring economic costs. Now, we have, in very broad terms, four alternatives. You can try to diversify your trade investment relationships. That is probably the most cost-effective way. You just have to make sure that you're creating real diversification. That's not always easy to do, but it's doable. And again, typically it's relatively cost-effective. The second one is to create a more balanced relationship vis-a-vis third parties. This can be difficult to do. It can be done, but there's no guarantee that the third party might not be exploiting this vulnerability at the end of the day. The third is reshoring. So what you would do here is, instead of relying on external suppliers or external investment, you try to produce things onshore. By and large, that's the most costly option. And more importantly, it doesn't necessarily diversify your economic risk, because if all your production is onshore, something happens onshore, again, you're facing significant problems. And the fourth one is more a strategy rather than perhaps a policy. This is where you're trying to create deterrence in traditional security terms, where you are implicitly threatening retaliation in case someone imposes costs on you. You're trying to impose costs on them in the hope that you will never have to execute on your threat. So these are really the four broad options. I'll be happy to go into details here when we get to the Q&A. Can we get the next slide, please? Here, it's the same issue when it comes to investment. Here's also just to highlight that, number one, Germany has a fair amount of foreign direct investment, and perhaps contrary to what some people might think, it's heavily concentrated in the US compared to China. One thing I would say here, though, is the numbers sometimes can be misleading. If you were to add Russia here, it wouldn't probably feature very, very significantly, but of course, given the energy dependence of Europe on Russia, as we have seen, even smaller numbers can matter quite a lot when it comes to FDI or trade. So that's something that needs to be explored more carefully. But here's just to make the point that, again, Germany is very open, and therefore generally much more vulnerable and sensitive to outside pressure and international economic conflict. Get the next slide, please. And here, and I'll sort of finish here as well. Here's some ideas around what could be done. As you know, there's been a big push in Berlin to create a national security council. Generally, this seems like a good idea as far as I can see. It might also make sense to think about establishing an economic security council. Now, this might be bureaucratic overkill, but economic security is much more than just what the economics ministry does. It involves many, many other areas. And I think taking a coordinated approach here would, I think, be quite useful without necessarily adding too many layers of bureaucracy here. And then ultimately, it's a question of, first of all, figure out what are the vulnerabilities. Now, we didn't know until COVID that there was a supply chain vulnerability when it comes to face masks or certain types of materials that are used to produce vaccines. So first of all, we have to establish what are these vulnerabilities and then think of a mitigation strategy. And this really requires a whole lot of policies that need to be integrated and coordinated to create an economic security strategy. And then what you can also do, and that's probably best done at the European level if at all possible, is to mitigate some of your risks. So some ideas here would be, and I think that's also being pursued at the moment, is to get a buyer's cartel. I think that's what is being thought about in Brussels when it comes to critical raw materials. Another idea would be to set up emergency funds that could be jointly financed, or even just set up a buyer's fund where you act as a buyer of last resort in case a third party imposes, say, restrictions on a country's exports. There's a lot of technical detail here, but these are just some ideas as how do you respond to potential instability and outside pressure. And then the last idea is this idea of deterrence, where you are, and I know that's difficult to stomach in many ways if you're very attached to the idea of WTO institutions, but this idea that if someone imposes costs on you and they're clearly motivated by political objectives, then you threaten to impose costs on them. Now, the risk here, of course, is of trade wars and economic conflict type that we saw in the 1930s. But it's worth thinking about whether this could not be an effective tool. If you manage it flexibly, it might just help prevent some of the conflict and some of the tensions that we're seeing. And again, here, of course, the EU has been looking at this for quite some time in the guise of the anti-coercion tool and also in terms of other instruments. So this is certainly being thought about, and I think this needs to be explored much further. And I think that gets into our last slide. And yes, just to sort of very broadly, don't worry about the details here. That's the way I would present it to my students. So basically, when it comes to economic security from a European or German perspective, you can pursue diversification in terms of trade and investment. You can try to create more balanced relationships that makes you less exploitable from a vulnerability point of view. You could also opt for autarky, so you reduce these interdependencies, but that doesn't necessarily remove the economic risk, and it's usually quite costly, as I mentioned. You could, in some cases, create emergency reserves, but they will only last so long. So this is not really a long-term strategy. And then lastly, as I highlighted a couple of times, you can think not just about mitigating those vulnerabilities, but put in place a policy that I guess in Europe is called anti-coercion policy, whereby you threaten to retaliate in case someone imposes economic costs on you for political reasons. And I think I've spoken too long already. I'll stop here and look forward to what my co-panelists have to say.
Well, thank you very much, Markus, for that wonderful overview. I can see that your students at Columbia are in for a treat getting into the weeds of economic statecraft and policy. So thank you very much. Claudia, I want to turn it over to you for some comments. Those are obviously the bread and butter issues of your daily work. And what we have learned in the strategy group the last two and a half years was also that obviously the German economy, and Markus alluded to this, has particular cluster risks associated with those dependencies. So I was wondering whether you could speak a bit about the vulnerability as well as the differences between Europe and the United States when it comes to the approach to China. I'll turn it over to you, please.
Thank you so much, Julian and Markus. I think that was a really excellent presentation, and hands up to summarize everything that you did in the past 2 years in these short times. So thank you so much. It was very, very interesting for me. My focus, especially because my co-commentator will have a US perspective, so I will try to focus a lot more on the European perspective. And you mentioned that the US-China rivalry is really gaining importance. I think this is also something that people talk more and more about in Berlin and how to react to that. I mean, in my view, and maybe also against the backdrop of the comments of the French president, I would say we're not in the middle of it. We are close to the United States. That's our major partner. But still, we have our own perspective on the whole rivalry. I just want to make sure that even though I think we have different perspectives and different interests, I still think the US is our partner and China is probably not. So I will start with a different perspective. As I said, from the US side, in my view, the whole US trade and investment policy right now is very much driven by the conflict with China. It started under Trump, and Biden has actually, in my view, continued this kind of policy. And this is much more about trade. It's more about a contest between different economic and political systems. So on the one side, you have China's hybrid economic model with a strong influence of the state, with increasing political repressions and human rights violations. And on the other side, you have the free market and democratic principles of the West. So the United States feels threatened by China would strengthen its ability to set the rules for the global economy in the future. And this leads to, I think we mentioned that already, this leads to market access restrictions. We have the Section 301 and 232 tariffs that are still in place. We have technological decoupling, and we have reshoring attempts. All this was mentioned in the strategy as well. So I think the EU has a different approach. So in many parts, it shares the concern that the United States has that relates to human rights violation, to violations of international trade law, to an increasingly aggressive economic and security policy. And hardly any European policymaker will still believe in Wandel durch Handel or change through trade that was guiding European and particularly German foreign economic policies for decades. So the EU has become increasingly tough on China. So it's changing its direction, but it still has a different strategic interest. It's not a hegemonic power, and it is different economic relationship with China. I think, Markus, you mentioned that also, the close connection between Germany and China. So we are very much dependent on China as an export market, as a production location. So even though the image of China is changing, the risk perception and the policy choices in the EU and also in Germany still differ. Nonetheless, and this was mentioned as well, the EU has increased its defensive trade toolbox. We have stronger export controls. You also mentioned the Netherlands. We have a new anti-coercion instrument. And Ursula von der Leyen, in her latest speech about China, which was very tough on China, also said that the EU wants to develop an economic security strategy at the end of this year, including thoughts about outbound investment screening. So we are following the US on this path. But still, I believe we have a different risk perception. And this is why I think with the pressure is mounting. And Markus, this is what you also referred to. The US sees the transatlantic relationship through the view of China, through the lens of China. So the US realizes that we have different interests or that we have complex relationship, but they will increasingly demand that we share more of the burden. And I think this kind of pressure is mounting. On export controls, on investment screening. And I think we will feel this kind of pressure. And I think the TTC, the Trade and Tech Council that was initiated, should be the forum to deal with this. And I hope that we will get very concrete outcomes here, because I see conflict also in the transatlantic relationship. My second point is on trade dependencies. And this was the slide that you mentioned. There's different ways of dealing with trade dependencies. And I wanted to look at the EU to see how they reacted to that. So the EU published a study about trade dependencies in 2021 already, and a follow-up study in 2022, and realized that 6% of EU imports relate to critical dependencies, which means they're dependent on one supplier, and it's very hard to diversify. And now the EU tries to set up a new strategy on how to deal with this. And I wanted to match some of the points that you mentioned, the 4 points. So domestic production capacity, diversify imports, or the 4 points. And I really wanted to have a look, how does the EU actually react to that? So the first point, set up domestic production capacities. The EU is following down this path, actually. We do have a CHIPS Act, similar to the United States. And we have the Green Deal Industrial Plan, which is supposed to be the answer to the US Inflation Reduction Act, where we definitely want to support national production in Europe. The second point is diversify imports. And coming from trade, I think this point is really, really important. I think we tend to think about defensive trade policy a lot, which is necessary in this new geo-economic environment. but we forget about the diversification part. And I think this is really important because we can decrease dependencies and it's cost effective. This is what you mentioned, Markus. It has improved market access also for critical raw materials. We have closer connection with partners. And I do not mean friendshoring, but with new reliable partners. And I think, therefore, it should be much more of a priority to have these kind of free trade agreements. And this relates to all larger powers that we have. Chile and Mexico, Australia and New Zealand in the Indo-Pacific, the Mercosur region, Indonesia. So these are all important free trade agreements. And I think it's necessary when we speak of deterrence to see that the other side of the coin is trade openness, and that we should pursue this path a lot more than we do right now. And then third-party control measures by threatening to withhold critical exports. That's the third point, how to react to trade dependencies. I think the EU is following this path. As I said, we have stronger export controls and also the anti-coercion instrument that will likely be in place at the end of this year. I think we had a consensus by the Parliament and by the Council, so this will definitely be set up this year. And the last point was create a strategic reserve of critical inputs. We have the European Chips Act, I just mentioned that, and the Critical Raw Materials Act, where we want to enhance also the national production in Europe on critical raw materials. So in short, I think the European Commission listened to your strategy, because they picked up on all 4 points that you mentioned. But my point here is really, yes, we need deterrence, but we also need the open side of trade policy. And we focus too much on strategic autonomy at the moment, and we should focus a lot more on open strategic autonomy and open trade agreements with reliable partners. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Claudia. Lots of things to pick up on. But before we do, I want to remind our audience, for those who joined us a bit late when I did the introduction. So we are unfortunately not joined by Nicholas Kessels from the BDI today, who had a family situation and cannot attend. But we have found a very suitable stellar replacement with Matt Burrows, who has spent his life thinking about the future and in the intelligence community assessing risks for the US government. So Matt, tell us, what is the US thinking about China, and why is that a problem for Europe? And how has your future thinking in the past compared to the reality that we have experienced?
Well, thanks, Julian. I'm not sure I've been thinking about the future my whole life. The last part of my career in the CIA, and also since the decade since I've been out of government, yes. But and thanks to DGAP, and thank you, Markus, too, for a wonderful presentation. I have 4 major points. First, to try to explain how I see the U.S. Fixation on China and the rising tensions. Talk a little bit about, what the sources of that, and also then getting into the future, thinking about where this is headed, and maybe end with a little bit on what I would see as both a warning for Europe, but also hopefully Europe can play a role in preventing what I think is a slide to World War III. So first, I think Markus's points are all correct. What I would add in terms of U.S. is that there is a very much an emotional quality. This is just not, 2 powers who, what I have explained it as, this is a divorce. You have to realize in the 90s, and nobody talks about this in the U.S. or anywhere else, we had Schmucker. So 2 powers, China and U.S., economically symbiotic. And at that point, There was, people couldn't see how this economic and what was also a political embrace would ever come apart. Then you move and you talked about the responsible stakeholder. This is at a point just about at the time of the 2008 financial crisis. And this is where the separation starts. First, China realizes that the U.S. is a lot more vulnerable than it had thought about. It was also rising very quickly, far more quickly than people had anticipated, including in China. And the U.S. was trying to, in some ways, reset this relationship so that the U.S. would still be on top judging whether or not China was a responsible stakeholder in the U.S. system. Now, I can tell you from firsthand, in briefing policymakers, and this is all on the record, you can go back, we wrote the Global Trends. This is a product of the National Intelligence Council. Global Trends looks out 15, 20 years. A lot of people use it. I know the Chancellor has used it. We wrote in 2004, 2005, China was going to be its own power. It was not going to accept a U.S.-dominated system. That was completely rejected by the top. This was by Condoleezza Rice in a meeting, because she could not imagine how China could be its own power. So this is part of the disappointment. Obviously, China did not fulfill all its promises when it joined the WTO, and the U.S. As soon as in 2001, made a great effort to bring China in. There are a lot of other things that China, and the property theft, the spying, etc., that has annoyed the U.S. But a lot of this, too, is that China has decided not to be part of the U.S. system. It is linked with the second point, which is fears of U.S. weakness. U.S., you talked about in terms of GDP and so on, China is going as rising ahead of the U.S. U.S. has the foreign policy elite in the U.S. has a very hard time of accepting that. They do not understand the term relative decline, and they have not accepted a multipolar world. Try to find that in a U.S. document, except for the ones that we published in the National Intelligence Council. There is, even by people, I would say Obama was very much attuned to what was happening. He did not want to have any mention of decline, and even in a relative sense. And to me, it was just a fact. So this is, and the problem now is that because of this fear of weakness, and nobody can quite want to go back to a bipolar world. They want to hold on to the unipolar world. So that means that China, you have a part of this is a delegitimization of China as a great power. And you will never find anywhere, try to find any mention of what China's legitimate interests as a great power are. It doesn't have any except for what the U.S. describes it as having. So the third point is that this is a united front. I mean, this is one of the few issues that from left to right, Democrat to Republican, all share. There was disappointment by China, certainly, but also many like myself, that when Biden came into office, after promising to reverse everything that Trump had done, China was the exception. He kept the tariffs on that Trump put down, and you could say he has not really even gone as far as Trump in establishing a personal relationship with Xi, even though he knew Xi when he was the vice president. He had visited China 11 times. but during the campaign, he called him a thug. And once you start down that road, we saw what happened after the Alaska meeting with a national security advisor and the Secretary of State, that, and now recently after the spy balloon, that there has been very little really connection at the top, and so the only group I would say that does not want that is the business world. And the story is not told at all, but how much U.S. multinational businesses still depend on China. They still see it as a big market in the same way that German big companies do. So let's get maybe looking ahead a little bit. I think, we are already in a Cold War. Yeah, the U.S. is already in a Cold War. And, with the CHIPS Act, with the restrictions, which Markus was talking about, the ones coming down the road, restricting all investment going into China from the U.S., we're pretty far down there in terms of mentality, wanting to exclude China, as I say, part of this delegitimization of China that is going on. And you have to realize the U.S. is a protectionist power now. After 2008, you can look this up, U.S. trade basically did not advance beyond that point. Before, during the 90s, the trade portion of GDP was rising, but it has leveled. It went down rapidly after 2008, but then leveled off. Germany, everybody's trade went down after 2008, but it advanced, continues to advance. Most of Europe has done lots of regional trade agreements with other powers in the world. The U.S. has only reenacted the trade agreement with Canada and Mexico. 2016, Trump said we're not going to get involved in the Trans-Pacific Partnership and left. TTIP was also dead at that point. So we have become a protectionist power. And that, that has some restrictions, I would say, for American business, obviously, but also the society itself has become much more inward looking, but terrifically nationalistic. I think what you have to look at is, and this is the warning to Europe, is a hot war may not be that far away. So if you are doing planning, you need to be thinking about this right now. In my sense, we're about, I see a World War I-like situation developing, and we're basically in the equivalent of 1912. The Russia invasion of Ukraine, instead of being a warning about what could happen in war, the dislocation that has happened, has not actually impeded any of the drive in Washington towards a confrontation. This really depends on what happens to Taiwan. Next year you have a presidential election. You have two contenders. One party, the KMT, is less eager for independence than the present DPP, but you have a congressional group that is already calling for Taiwan to declare independence. And once it does that, China has no option but to really consider military. I don't think it would be a frontal invasion. I think it would be a blockade. There are a lot of other scenarios we can get into on that. But the issue is, they want to tighten the screws on China. They already are. Europe this, I don't think Macron is right that, Europe could be on the sidelines. I think it will be dragged in if we get into a war situation. I do think that Europe needs to play a part on warning it does not want to go down that road, because there is an assumption in Washington that Europe owes Washington for Ukraine, helping Ukraine, and it expects Europe to go completely and fully with the U.S. against China. Now, that is something that Europeans don't seem to understand what is going on. And there needs to be also, I think, given, as Markus has shown, Europeans are far more dependent on trade with China, what the implications for Europe will be. Now, I need to stop. I see Julian on the edge of his seat there, but just let me say, there's a book out in Germany with Joseph Brommel that together we have written, so you can read in far more detail what I've been just talking about. Beck is the publisher and should be out in the autumn.
Well, thank you very much, Matt, for that sober analysis of U.S. thinking. I want to give a chance to Markus and Claudia to respond. Obviously, the Taiwan escalation scenario would be if similar sanctions were to be imposed. Then we've seen in the Ukraine-Russia scenario, that would be a catastrophe for the German economy. But even if we fall short of an entire escalatory scenario, the implications for the German economy will be quite large. So, Markus, maybe you want to get the chance, since the two commentators commented on your work, to follow up on that before we move it into a broader panel.
Sure, I'll try to be very quick. Well, thank you so much for your very thoughtful comments. I'll start with Claudia. I mean, it's good to hear that the Europeans are working on this, and I would just second what Matt said. If I put my money on war, not war, for now, I think the short run it's unlikely. But that doesn't really matter what I think or what assessment I come to. The fact is that if war were to happen, how well is Europe positioned to deal with its economic vulnerabilities? And I think that requires you to work on some scenarios. Would it be a blockade? Would it be a full-blown invasion? What kind of measures would the United States take? Would U.S. allies cooperate with the United States in terms of sanctions? So even if you think a war is not likely, and I don't think it is, but let's assume it is, you really need to prepare for this. You need to prepare for these contingencies. I think maybe I'll differ a little bit with Matt, and I think we had this discussion before. I think there's different ways of looking at this. You can look at this from the bottom up and look at what's going on in Washington, what are people talking about, and I can't really disagree with them in terms of the fact that if there's bipartisan consensus in Washington, it's about China, and there's no other topic where you find consensus. And you will not be able to work for any administration if you don't toe the line on this one. So I think that's why it's very important to have these debates about, is it the right course of action? On the other hand, the way I tend to look at this, and I don't want to be deterministic about this, we've seen this movie many times before. We have a power that is in relative decline, arguably. We can argue this, but let's assume the US is in relative decline, and certainly has been over the past 20 years. Then there's going to be conflict over changing the status quo, changing the institutions, whether it's the IMF or the global security regime or global oil markets. This is a natural outflow of that competition. And so I take a much more structural view, but of course a structural view in a sense reduces agency. And when you sit in Washington, of course the focus has to be an agency. I'm not saying nothing can be done. All I would note is that we've seen this movie many times before. And to me, the question is more, how do we manage this great power competition? And then secondarily for the Europeans, how do they want to position themselves? And I think it is true that Washington is expecting Europe to support its China policy. To my mind, it hasn't done so massively forcefully yet, but to the extent that competition becomes more intense in Asia, I would expect US pressure to increase, perhaps not so much in terms of demanding and asking for frigates and ships moving out there. I mean, that may or may not happen, but certainly in the economic realm, as I pointed out. And then for Claudia's comment, it's very good to hear that the Europeans are, again, working on this. I think here what I would like to see, it's great you have started, but I would like to see a more comprehensive strategic approach. So it seems to me, and I could be wrong on this because I'm too far away from Brussels, that the vulnerability pops up, people say, well, hey, look, we have a vulnerability when it comes to lithium, or we have a vulnerability when it comes to ABC. How do we address this? We have financial exposure. How do we address this? So it's a very piecemeal approach. What I would also like to see is people stepping back and integrating a view of economic, financial, trade vulnerability. And for example, when it comes to trade, import vulnerabilities are quite different from export vulnerabilities. So I'd like, if you will, strategists or people who work on these issues to take a comprehensive view at the national and European level. And then ultimately also, they should raise the question, can we cooperate with the United States to create some sort of defensive regime where when there is geoeconomic pressure, can we sort of support each other? I suppose that is to some extent the idea behind the US Technology Trade Council. But my sense is we haven't really seen all that much come out of it. But I'll defer to Claudia on this because I know she's looking at it very, very closely and talking to a lot of people on the ground.
Thank you, Markus. Claudia, please respond to this. And I would want to add a question. You've obviously made the plea for a closer transatlantic relationship in that regard. Maybe you can also speak a bit about the disappointment that has been visible in Europe over the Inflation Reduction Act and sort of the protectionist tendencies that don't just go towards China, but also to one of its closest allies, Europe, and that the idea of friendshoring was very much undermined by industrial policy that the Biden administration has put forward with the last Congress. So maybe those 2 points for you.
Okay, I start with a couple of points. Is Europe prepared and would it go to war? I mean, we have the G7 foreign ministers meeting that happened this morning in Japan. We have a very, very strong language on China, actually surprisingly so. I think very strong language on economic coercion, on security threats in the Indo-Pacific. So I do think that we have a convergence, and I do think that we would react to China, to a breach of international law. This is what we see with Russia right now. And even though China, we are much more dependent on China and much more interconnected with China, I think that we will want to have a similar reaction that we see to the Russian aggression if something happened with Taiwan. And I think when you look at the statement of the G7, they are very much willing to work together on this, and they are really, really willing to show this kind of unity. Are we prepared right now? No, we are not. We are just starting. I think COVID-19 was a first test. What happens if the Chinese market closes? It was a small test with the closure of the Shanghai market. And now we have the Russian aggression, which shows the real test on vulnerabilities. And now we start thinking how to react. This will not come fast. We are thinking about so many issues like, do we follow economic decoupling? How do we diversify? I mean, we have all these trade agreements, fine, but can we sign them? Have we finished them? Can we ratify them? Then we want to have stress tests and compulsory stress tests for a geo-economic situation. All this needs to be developed. So no, Europe is not prepared, but we are getting there. But I'm not sure we have as much time as we would need. Markus, to your point, comprehensive view, yes, that would be very necessary. And not only on the European level, but also on the German level. We need a strategic view, and this is why I very much agree with your Economic Security Council. We need different perspectives on this. It's not only a trade issue or investment issue, it's a security issue as well. And it needs to be a strategic decision. It's very hard for the Commission. I mean, you know about European institutions. It's very hard for DG Trade to come up with that. But we need to think in this direction because this is where the environment is going. The Inflation Reduction Act, yes, that's our favorite topic. We were so happy about the Trade and Technology Council that we have something after TTIP, which did not work out. And we thought that now this is an end to all transatlantic trade conflicts that we have. So we solved or postponed steel and aluminum. resolved or postponed Airbus Boeing and thought that we will now, with the TTC, live happily after ever. And now we have the Inflation Reduction Act, and this is all that Europe talks about right now. And it is seen as something that's very unfair. And again, where the US only looks at itself, that we have Biden speaking about the EU as an ally, but in reality, it's not working. I think when I look at the attempts by the United States to include the allies to different perspective, I think here in this case, I would like to defend the United States because it's the political system. It's the U.S. Congress. It was an internal compromise in the U.S. Congress. It was supposed to be a Green New Deal, and I think this is how it worked out because Congress still has authority on commerce. And I think that the Biden administration right now is really showing or trying to get the allies on board. I think it was unfortunate because it was a rift and a gap in the transatlantic relationship. And truly, this is all everybody talks about in Berlin, how unfair this is. I think it's not a good sign, but I think the United States is right now really trying to mend that bridge.
Thank you, Claudia. Alluding to the fact that all politics is local here in the United States, absolutely something that I could sign. So we already have a lot of questions in the chat, and I want to get to them for sure. But I want to end kind of the internal panel discussion with a rather controversial question. And Matt, I'll turn it over to you first. When it comes to China, would you argue that European and American interests are the same and are going to be the same in 5 years if the US is continuing its decoupling and great power competition narrative?
Well, I don't think they are the same. I mean, I think, going back to what I said, the U.S. has veered into much more protectionism, and that's not just with China, but other countries as well. And I think Europe, which historically has always been more open, is basically on a different path, wanting to really engage, just not with China, but large swaths of the developing world in ways that we aren't. I mean, beyond Mexico, we've had in the U.S. have had a very hard time of actually going on and doing trade deals with large South American countries and also others in Asia. So I think those interests are different. I would hope, that Europe sees its role as trying to be peacemaker, and in that sense, should be thinking about how, instead of just siding with the U.S., actually how to help resolve the conflict, because I think, this is not going to stop. Whoever wins in a war over Taiwan's not going to stop there. I mean, this is the opening of as I said before, of a much broader war. I mean, this would be escalating to World War III. So you're putting in danger really the rest of the world, and also, after we fight for 15, 20 years, the climate change will take over and do the rest, right?
Thank you very much, Matt. This concludes our event today. I want to thank all of you on behalf of the German Council on Foreign Relations for joining in, spending your evening with us here today to talk about the transatlantic relationship in times of great power competition. I think it was a terrific panel with a lot of expertise and insight on a variety of issues, and it just showcased the relevance of strategic thinking, of scenario planning, both within the European as well as in the transatlantic and global context. Thanks again for the Friede Springer Foundation to make all of this possible. As I said, it concludes the project that we have done on the future of transatlantic relations. And I'm sending liebe Grüße aus Washington, and I hope everybody is having a nice evening. Thank you very much. Ciao.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.